In the first half of the 20th century, submarines moved from experimental craft to instruments of national strategy. The First World War had demonstrated that small, unseen vessels could threaten industrial economies by cutting sea lines of communication. German U-boats had sunk more than 11 million gross tons of Allied and neutral shipping, a figure studied closely in Washington and Tokyo alike. Naval planners in both capitals drew different lessons from the same experience. The United States Navy largely treated submarines as scouts and auxiliaries to a surface battle fleet, while the Imperial Japanese Navy considered them long-range weapons to weaken an approaching enemy task force before a decisive surface engagement in the Western Pacific. The geopolitical alignment of the interwar years made the Pacific the most likely arena for a future clash. The Washington and London naval treaties imposed strict tonnage limits on capital ships, but fewer constraints on submarines. At the same time, Japan's ambitions in East Asia and the Western Pacific, including its position in Manchuria and later its war in China, created a widening gap with U.S. interests in the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, and the China trade. American war planning under successive versions of War Plan Orange assumed that any conflict with Japan would begin with the loss or isolation of forward bases and require a transoceanic advance by the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Submarines were integrated into these plans as reconnaissance units, screens for major formations, and attrition forces against enemy warships rather than as a primary instrument of economic blockade. Within this framework, a generation of U.S. officers built their careers around the new boats. Chester W. Nimitz, a Texas-born officer who graduated from the Naval Academy in 1905, served in some of the earliest U.S. submarines and later commanded the Atlantic Submarine Flotilla and the First Submarine Flotilla, gaining practical experience with undersea navigation, engineering problems, and the human demands of small crew operations. Charles A. Lockwood, born in Virginia in 1890 and commissioned in 1912, followed a similar path. By 1914, he already commanded the small A-class submarine, A-2, and later Submarine Division 1 in the Asiatic Fleet, spending much of his sea career in or around submarines and the support infrastructure they required. The professional outlook of both men was shaped by peacetime exercises, long deployments on early designs with short range and limited habitability, and the absence of any large-scale U.S. combat use of submarines after 1918. Public sentiment and political debate in the United States gave these technical preparations an uncertain foundation. The interwar period combined isolationist currents in Congress and the electorate with strong support for a Navy capable of defending U.S. interests in two oceans. Budget constraints during the Great Depression slowed naval construction, but did not halt it. New U.S. fleet submarines of the Porpoise, Salmon, and Sargo classes appeared in the 1930s, designed for long-range Pacific operations, but the total size of the force remained modest compared to surface units. On the eve of war, the U.S. Navy possessed about 111 submarines in commission, many of them older designs without the latest fire control equipment, and only part of this total was based in the Pacific. Japan's position was different, but equally dependent on maritime infrastructure. The island empire imported much of its oil, bauxite, rubber, and foodstuffs, and its merchant marine in 1939 comprised more than 2,300 ships totaling over 5.6 million gross tons. Yet, Japanese naval doctrine did not define submarines primarily as commerce raiders against this traffic. Instead, the Imperial Japanese Navy invested in large, long-range I-class boats capable of operating with the fleet across the Pacific, conducting reconnaissance, attacking enemy capital ships, and undertaking special missions such as midget submarine attacks and supply runs to isolated garrisons. At the outbreak of the Pacific War, Japan fielded roughly 60 to 70 ocean-going submarines, with additional midget and coastal types in reserve or construction. Intelligence assessments on both sides reflected these structural realities. U.S. analysts in the Office of Naval Intelligence and at the Naval War College recognized the vulnerability of Japanese industry to a disruption of ocean transport, but Pre-war doctrine and rules of engagement still emphasized adherence to prize law and restrictions on unrestricted submarine warfare, at least in principle. Japanese planners, drawing their own conclusions from the First World War, studied Allied convoy systems, but expected that the geography of the Pacific and the offensive orientation of U.S. fleet plans would delay comprehensive convoy organization for American shipping. Neither side fully anticipated that submarines would be used primarily against merchant shipping from the opening months of a Pacific conflict. By the late 1930s, rising tensions made these theoretical debates increasingly concrete. Japanese expansion into China, the occupation of French Indochina, and the resulting U.S. oil and scrap metal embargoes created a strategic confrontation in which both navies expected that any war would be decided by control of sea lanes stretching thousands of kilometers. In this environment, officers such as Nimitz, who would later command the Pacific Fleet, and Lockwood, who would direct its submarine force, entered the final pre-war years with a professional belief in the utility of submarines, but within institutions that still regarded them as adjuncts to battleships and carriers. The organizational structures, training patterns, and material inventories established before December 1941 would frame how U.S. submarine warfare actually unfolded once hostilities began. On December 7, 1941, the theoretical war plans that had shaped interwar exercises gave way to events. While carrier aircraft of the Imperial Japanese Navy struck Pearl Harbor, Japanese submarine forces deployed in support. I-class boats formed patrol lines to the east of Hawaii to report any American ships that escaped the air attack. Several carried midget submarines intended to infiltrate the harbor itself. Their mission reflected pre-war doctrine. Submarines were to assist the fleet in crippling enemy capital ships at the outset of hostilities, not to wage independent war against merchant traffic. The United States entered the conflict with its submarine force divided between oceans and bases already threatened. In the Pacific, roughly 50 modern fleet submarines and older boats were spread between Pearl Harbor, Midway, and the Asiatic fleet bases at Cavite in the Philippines and Fremantle in Australia. At Pearl Harbor, most U.S. submarines escaped serious damage because they lay in distant berths or at sea during the attack. In the Philippines, however, the same day's news was followed within hours by Japanese airstrikes that destroyed destroyers, auxiliaries, and facilities of the Asiatic fleet and reduced its surface strength, forcing its submarines into an immediate defensive campaign along the approaches to Luzon. Command structures on both sides framed how these first weeks unfolded. Japanese submarines in the Central Pacific operated under combined fleet, coordinating with carrier task forces and surface units. Their early patrols targeted American warships and attempted to monitor the movement of any surviving capital ships. U.S. submarines in the Pacific fell under the authority of the Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, whose headquarters shifted from the damaged Pearl Harbor Naval Base to underground facilities. When Chester Nimitz assumed this post at the end of December 1941, he inherited not only a fleet recovering from losses in battleships and aircraft, but also a submarine force that would be the only major arm capable of striking Japanese positions across the Pacific in the near term. Charles Lockwood began the war in a different environment. In 1941, he served as naval attaché in London, observing British anti-submarine warfare and convoy practices in the Battle of the Atlantic. From this position, he followed the outbreak of war in the Pacific at diplomatic distance, compiling reports on German U-boat tactics and Allied countermeasures. The contrast between the Atlantic, where submarines already focused on merchant shipping, and the Pacific, where doctrine still emphasized fleet support, was evident in the information crossing his desk. As the first patrols left American bases after Pearl Harbor, their missions reflected this transitional state. Submarines were dispatched to Japanese home waters, the South China Sea, and the approaches to the Carolines and Marshalls with orders to attack enemy naval units and, under newly issued unrestricted warfare directives, merchant ships as well. Crews confronted practical difficulties that had not been fully resolved in peacetime. Unreliable magnetic exploders on Mark 14 torpedoes, incomplete intelligence about Japanese shipping routes, and the lack of a fully developed convoy system to use as a framework for patrol planning. Japanese commanders, for their part, committed many of their submarines to support further offensive operations around the Netherlands East Indies and to reconnaissance off Australia and the American West Coast, rather than concentrating on cutting U.S. logistics at their source. For sailors, staff officers, and civilian observers, these initial months appeared as an experimental phase rather than a settled pattern. In Tokyo, the early successes of carrier and surface forces encouraged confidence that the decisive engagements would continue to be fought by aircraft and battleships, with submarines in a supporting role. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, operational reports from returning U.S. submarines showed both the potential of long-range patrols and the limitations imposed by technical faults and doctrinal uncertainty. Between these perspectives, the opening phase of submarine warfare in the Pacific emerged as a period in which pre-war assumptions were tested at sea, but not yet replaced by a coherent new strategy. Strategic planning for submarine operations in the Pacific developed under pressure in early 1942. Within days of the outbreak of hostilities, the United States authorized unrestricted submarine warfare against Japanese shipping, moving beyond pre-war legal limitations. This decision defined a central objective: to reduce the flow of oil, coal, bauxite, food, and manufactured goods that connected the Japanese home islands with occupied territories in East and Southeast Asia. Staff officers in Washington and Pearl Harbor calculated that Japan's merchant fleet, with several million gross tons of capacity, had limited margin for loss before industrial output, and military operations would be constrained. Submarines were expected to exploit this vulnerability, while the damaged surface fleet and still expanding carrier force rebuilt strength. Operational plans translated these broad aims into patrol zones, target priorities, and logistical arrangements. In the Pacific, Submarine Force, Pacific Fleet received primary responsibility for offensive operations against Japanese sea communications. Nimitz's headquarters assigned boats to patrol lines around the Japanese home islands in the South China Sea and along approaches to major bases such as Truk and Rabaul. Submarines were instructed to give priority to tankers and large cargo ships, but also to report movements of combat units for use by other arms. Bases at Pearl Harbor, later reinforced by Australian ports such as Brisbane and Fremantle, were developed into hubs with submarine tenders, repair facilities, torpedo depots, and training centers, allowing a regular cycle of patrol, refit, and crew rotation. Chester Nimitz's own background in submarine service influenced how the Pacific Fleet staff approached these questions. Familiar with the technical limits of endurance, battery capacity, and crew fatigue in earlier designs, he and his advisors understood that long-range patrols of 50 to 70 days would test both material and personnel. Planning, therefore, emphasized reliable communications, weather reporting, and standardized patrol procedures. Rear area training commands worked to improve fire control solutions and periscope attack techniques, while shore-based intelligence sections began compiling merchant ship registers, silhouettes, and estimated route patterns to brief departing crews. Charles Lockwood, moving from London to the Pacific Theater in 1942, brought a different but complementary perspective. His exposure to British experience in the Atlantic, where German U-boats had already inflicted extensive tonnage losses and where escort and convoy systems had evolved in response, provided a comparative framework. As he took up responsibilities for submarines in the Southwest Pacific, first from temporary forward locations and then from Fremantle, he applied these observations to the conditions of the Indian Ocean and Western Pacific. Patrol planning in his area of command had to account for longer distances between bases and hunting grounds, different oceanographic conditions, and the dispersed pattern of Japanese shipping to and from the Netherlands East Indies. Japanese strategic goals for submarine forces remained closely tied to fleet doctrine. Combined fleet planners expected a protracted campaign in which American task forces would advance across the Pacific along predictable lines of approach. Submarines were to operate in support of this concept by scouting ahead, reporting enemy movements, and attacking major warships to weaken them before surface battle. Logistics reflected these priorities. Large I-class submarines were based at forward anchorages such as Kwajalein, Truk, and later Saipan, positioned to operate near anticipated U.S. lines of advance. Fuel, torpedoes, and spare parts were allocated to sustain long-range patrols that concentrated on naval rather than merchant targets. Miscalculations were embedded in both sides' planning. In the United States, the Bureau of Ordnance entered the war confident in the performance of the Mark 14 torpedo and its magnetic exploder. Pre-war tests, conducted under controlled conditions, had not revealed systematic defects at operational depths and speeds. As a result, early submarine patrol orders assumed that a limited stock of torpedoes would yield proportionally high sinkings, a premise that shaped expectations for the tempo of the campaign. In Japan, naval leadership underestimated the potential impact of a sustained enemy commerce war and delayed the introduction of comprehensive convoy systems and dedicated escort forces, particularly in the early years, when shipping losses appeared manageable. Propaganda and public communication followed these strategic frameworks but did not fully reveal them. In the United States, official statements emphasized carrier strikes and surface actions, while submarine operations were reported in more general terms, often without naming specific boats or commanders. In Japan, public information focused on victories by carrier and army units, presenting submarines as one component of a broad offensive across the Pacific and Asia. For planners, however, internal documents and war games treated submarine warfare as a long-term factor that, if properly organized, could steadily alter the balance of resources and operational freedom at sea. Within this environment, officers such as Nimitz and Lockwood worked to align doctrine, logistics, and training with the emerging reality of a protracted maritime conflict. The first months of active submarine warfare in the Pacific unfolded against a background of rapid territorial change. In December 1941 and January 1942, U.S. submarines of the Asiatic Fleet operated from Cavite and later from temporary anchorages in the Netherlands East Indies as Japanese forces advanced through the Philippines and Malaya. Crews of S-class and newer fleet submarines patrolled the Luzon approaches, the South China Sea, and the Makassar Strait, attempting to intercept invasion convoys bound for Lingayen Gulf, Lemon Bay, and later Java. Their attacks contributed to the loss and damage of several transports and smaller escorts, but they could not prevent the fall of Manila in early January, or the progressive isolation of Bataan and Corregidor. As surface strength of the Asiatic Fleet diminished under air attack and attrition, submarines became its most mobile surviving arm. Boats such as USS S-38, USS S-37, and later USS Sea Lion, too operated in shallow, constricted waters, facing strong currents, limited depth for evasion, and increasing Japanese air patrols. Commanders reported firing multiple torpedoes at transports and cruisers with apparent hits that failed to detonate. A pattern later traced to defects in the Mark 14 torpedo and its exploder. From the perspective of the crews and their commanders, the contrast between risk taken and confirmed sinkings created tension and uncertainty about both tactics and equipment. In late January 1942, a patrol by USS Gudgeon near the Japanese home islands produced a different type of early engagement. Operating off Shikoku, the boat detected and attacked the submarine Boomsist 73, which was en route between Japan and the Central Pacific. The subsequent sinking was one of the first confirmed destructions of a Japanese warship by a U.S. submarine and demonstrated that American boats could operate close to the enemy's coasts, despite limited intelligence about patrol patterns and minefields. For Japanese naval personnel, the loss underscored that the home waters were no longer beyond direct hostile action, although overall shipping movements continued without large-scale rerouting at this stage. Civilians experienced these developments indirectly, but with growing impact. In the Philippines, the progressive loss of control over sea routes limited the evacuation of military dependents and refugees. Some merchant and auxiliary vessels attempted to carry personnel south toward Australia and the Netherlands East Indies, sometimes under submarine escort, sometimes without. The occupation of major ports by Japanese forces reoriented regional trade and supply, redirecting shipping to support military garrisons and resource extraction. Early U.S. submarine attacks on convoys carrying troops and supplies to newly captured territories contributed to local shortages and disrupted schedules, even when they did not result in large numbers of ships sunk. Japanese submarines, for their part, took part in early offensive operations that mirrored pre-war assumptions. In support of the Rabaul, Java, and Indian Ocean campaigns, I-class boats reconnoitered ahead of task forces, reported on Allied ship movements, and attacked warships when opportunities arose. Patrols off Australia and the American West Coast resulted in several torpedo attacks on merchant and naval vessels, as well as shelling incidents against shore installations. For Allied coastal populations, these episodes, although limited in scale, reinforced the perception that the war had extended to previously secure waters. For Japanese command staffs, the results confirmed the ability of submarines to operate at long range, but the emphasis remained on fleet support rather than systematic commerce interdiction. Morale on both sides reflected this mixed pattern of outcomes. U.S. submarine crews saw individual successes, but also experienced frequent torpedo malfunctions, mechanical failures, and the loss of several boats to depth charges and air attack. Patrol reports and post-patrol debriefings began to accumulate technical evidence that challenged pre-war confidence in key weapons, but formal acceptance of these conclusions came slowly. Japanese crews in the submarine arm participated in early victories by contributing reconnaissance and occasional sinkings of Allied units, yet their primary contribution remained largely invisible to the broader public, which focused on the rapid capture of territories across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. These first engagements established habits and expectations that would shape later operations. Patrol areas, approaches to attack, and methods of evasion were tested under combat conditions. Both navies observed the results of their own and their opponents' actions and drew conclusions, some accurate, some misleading, about the effectiveness of submarine warfare. Within this evolving environment, officers such as Chester Nimitz and Charles Lockwood received a growing body of operational data that would inform subsequent changes in doctrine, training, and technical policy. By mid-1942, submarine operations in the Pacific entered a phase of escalation marked by greater reach and higher expectations, but also by technical and organizational difficulties. As U.S. carrier and surface forces fought around the Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal, submarines extended their patrols from the approaches to Japan and the Philippines to the Solomons, the Bismarck Sea, and the northern routes toward the Kuriles. In 1942, U.S. submarines in the Pacific and Indian Oceans sank roughly 180 Japanese merchant ships, totaling about 750,000 gross tons, together with a limited number of warships. Against a pre-war Japanese merchant fleet exceeding 6 million gross tons, these losses were significant but not yet decisive. Japanese shipping lanes continued to function, supplying forces from Hokkaido to New Guinea. The crisis that developed within the U.S. submarine force was as much technical as operational. Patrol reports repeatedly described torpedoes passing under targets, failing to detonate, or exploding prematurely. Commanders reported entire spreads fired at tankers and transports with no confirmed hits despite favorable firing angles and ranges. Shore-based analysis suggested that depth control, contact exploders, and magnetic influence mechanisms in the Mark 14 torpedo and its Mark 6 exploder were not performing as specified. Yet the Bureau of Ordnance, relying on limited pre-war test data, initially rejected the conclusion that the weapons themselves were at fault. This divergence created tension between frontline commanders seeking to use aggressive tactics and technical authorities responsible for procurement and design. Charles Lockwood encountered these problems directly after assuming command of submarines based in Fremantle and Brisbane. His boats operated over long distances into the Java Sea, the South China Sea, and along the western approaches to the Japanese Empire. Crews returned with accounts of missed opportunities against convoys carrying oil from the Netherlands East Indies or troops to New Guinea. Lockwood supported live fire tests under controlled conditions, including firing torpedoes at cliff faces and old hulks, which demonstrated recurrent depth and detonation failures. These results strengthened his view that the crisis in results was rooted not only in tactics, but in the basic reliability of the main U.S. submarine weapon. On the Japanese side, escalation took a different form. Submarines were used to reinforce campaigns around Guadalcanal and New Guinea by attacking U.S. carriers, cruisers, and transports, and by delivering supplies to isolated garrisons. Japanese boats torpedoed several Allied warships, including heavy cruisers and destroyers supporting Solomon Islands operations. However, the number of submarines assigned to systematic attacks on merchant convoys remained limited, and convoy organization for Japanese shipping expanded only gradually. Naval leaders prioritized offensive missions that aligned with the traditional concept of a decisive fleet battle, even as losses to merchant shipping and the need to supply dispersed island campaigns increased. For sailors and civilians, this period combined growing risks with incomplete protection. Japanese merchant crews sailing from Moji or Osaka to Singapore, Rabaul or Balikpapan increasingly encountered reports of submarine attacks along standard routes, but most voyages still proceeded without escort or with only minimal protection. U.S. submariners faced denser patterns of air patrols, more frequent depth charge attacks by escorts, and the psychological strain of repeated firings that appeared to produce few observable results. Families of crew members on both sides began to receive notifications of missing submarines, often with little detailed information about where or how the losses had occurred, since many boats disappeared without survivors. Politically, the discrepancy between expectations and outcomes created pressure. In Washington, planners had anticipated that unrestricted submarine warfare would rapidly erode Japanese shipping capacity. When early figures did not match these projections, questions arose about training, leadership, and equipment. Chester Nimitz, responsible for all Pacific Fleet submarines, had to reconcile reports from the front with institutional resistance to acknowledging torpedo defects. In Tokyo, the focus of high-level discussions remained on major battles and ground campaigns, but staff officers tracking tonnage and fuel reserves began to note that losses, while still within replacement capacity, were trending upward. This phase of escalation and crisis did not yet resolve the underlying issues. Tactical innovation at sea, adjustments in patrol zones, and incremental changes in Japanese routing and escort procedures continued. At the same time, the accumulating operational evidence assembled by commanders such as Lockwood and evaluated at Pacific Fleet headquarters formed the basis for decisions that would, in the next stage of the campaign, alter both the effectiveness of U.S. submarine warfare and the vulnerability of Japanese maritime logistics. By early 1943, the submarine war in the Pacific reached a critical operational peak, defined not by a single battle, but by a series of decisions that transformed accumulated experience into systematic practice. One of the most important organizational changes came when Charles Lockwood assumed command of Submarine Force, Pacific Fleet. From his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, he now directed the majority of U.S. submarine operations against Japanese shipping. Drawing on earlier trials in Australia, and on data from patrol reports, Lockwood authorized further live fire tests that confirmed depth keeping and exploder defects in the Mark 14 torpedo. The subsequent decision to deactivate the magnetic exploder and recalibrate depth settings markedly increased the proportion of successful attacks reported from mid-1943 onward. With weapon reliability gradually improving, Chester Nimitz and his staff reoriented submarine tasking around a more systematic campaign against Japanese logistics. Patrol zones were adjusted to concentrate on choke points, where traffic from the Netherlands East Indies, the Central Pacific, and the South China Sea converged. Submarines were increasingly deployed in coordinated wolf-pack groups of 3 boats with a designated commander, allowing them to share contact information and maintain pressure on convoys that might otherwise escape after a single attack. These methods, adapted from Atlantic practice but adjusted to Pacific distances and radio conditions, expanded the reach of the submarine force beyond individual patrols. Japanese High Command responded by accelerating measures that had previously been introduced only in limited form. Beginning in 1943, convoy organization for merchant shipping became more extensive. Tankers carrying oil from Balikpapan or Palembang transports supplying garrisons in New Guinea and the Solomons, and freighters moving coal and food toward the home islands increasingly sailed in escorted groups rather than independently. Specially built escort vessels and converted destroyers were assigned to protect them, while land-based aircraft flew anti-submarine patrols along major routes. However, the number of available escorts and aircraft remained smaller than the total demand for protection across a maritime empire, stretching from the Aleutians to the Indian Ocean. Statistical trends reflected these changes. In 1943 alone, U.S. submarines operating in the Pacific and adjacent seas sank more than 1.7 million gross tons of Japanese merchant shipping, more than double the previous year. As the campaign intensified in 1944, annual sinkings reached approximately 3.9 million gross tons. These figures represented a substantial fraction of Japan's remaining ocean-going capacity. Tankers and large cargo vessels formed a significant share of the losses, directly affecting the transport of oil, fuel, and raw materials. For Nimitz and Lockwood, such numbers indicated that the submarine force had become one of the principal instruments for constraining Japan's ability to sustain combat operations far from the home islands. The human impact of this peak phase extended beyond the crews of submarines and escorts. Japanese merchant sailors faced increasing risk on voyages that had previously been routine. Sailings from Southeast Asia to Japan involved long periods in zones where submarine attacks were frequent, and survival chances after torpedo hits in distant waters were limited. Civilians in the home islands began to experience more pronounced shortages of fuel and certain foodstuffs as the cumulative effect of shipping losses constrained imports. In occupied territories, local populations encountered new requisition policies and adjustments in distribution, as Japanese authorities sought to maintain flows of resources to the metropolitan economy despite the losses at sea. For Allied prisoners of war and civilian internees transported by sea, the intensified submarine offensive had ambiguous consequences. As Japan used merchant vessels to move POWs and laborers between territories and the home islands, some of these ships were attacked and sunk by U.S. submarines, unaware of their human cargoes. The resulting loss of life among prisoners and Asian laborers, often recorded only fragmentarily in wartime documents, illustrated how a campaign aimed at economic and military targets intersected with wider patterns of forced movement across the region. Within submarine crews themselves, the concentration of operations and higher success rates brought both recognition and strain. Longer patrols, more frequent attacks, and denser enemy defenses increased cumulative fatigue. Submarines had to navigate not only the risk of depth charges and air attack, but also the expanding fields of defensive mine barriers laid by both sides. Maintenance demands grew as hulls, engines, and sensors accumulated wear from repeated extended cruises. Training, rest periods, and rotation policies became major planning factors for Lockwood's staff as they worked to sustain operational tempo without eroding the long-term effectiveness of the force. At the level of combined operations, the peak period of submarine warfare coincided with major Allied offensives across the Central and Southwest Pacific. Carrier and amphibious forces moving toward the Gilberts, Marshalls, Marianas, and the Philippines relied on secure supply lines from the United States, which remained largely unthreatened by Japanese submarines after their early forays. In contrast, Japanese fleets and distant garrisons operated under increasing constraints as submarine attacks reduced tanker availability and forced more circuitous routing. The interaction between these sea lane dynamics and decisions taken by commanders such as Nimitz and Lockwood created conditions in which the balance of maritime mobility in the Pacific shifted decisively, even before the final land campaigns reached the inner defensive perimeter of the Japanese home islands. As Japanese shipping losses mounted in 1943 and 1944, resistance to the submarine campaign developed on several levels. Naval staff in Tokyo issued directives for tighter route control, designating specific sea lanes between the home islands and key resource areas, such as the Netherlands East Indies and the South China Sea. Convoy schedules were drawn up so that multiple merchant vessels departed together with assigned escorts, rather than sailing singly. New escort ships of the Kaiboken type were built with sonar and depth charge gear, while older destroyers were refitted for anti-submarine work. Land-based aircraft expanded patrols from bases in Formosa, the Philippines, and the Ryukyus, creating overlapping zones of air and surface surveillance along major routes. These measures forced U.S. submarines to adapt their own procedures. Patrol reports describe denser screen formations around convoys, more rapid and accurate depth charge counterattacks, and increased use of radar and searchlights by escorts at night. In response, Lockwood's headquarters refined doctrines for submerged daylight approaches and surface night attacks using radar. Training emphasized coordinated operations by groups of boats, with one submarine maintaining contact and reporting convoy courses while others maneuvered into attack positions. Radio discipline and encrypted communication procedures were revised to balance security with the need for timely information, sharing within these groups. Technology formed another field of adaptation. U.S. submarines received improved radar sets for surface search and air warning, enhancing their ability to detect convoys and avoid patrol aircraft. Sonar, periscopes, and fire control systems were upgraded as boats rotated through refit periods at Pearl Harbor, Midway, and forward bases. Japanese forces, in turn, deployed more capable sonar equipment on escorts and experimented with radar on some units. Both sides laid additional minefields in strategic straits and approaches. For submarine crews, these developments added new variables to every patrol. Electronic emissions had to be managed carefully to avoid detection, while navigation through mined waters demanded precise charting and dead reckoning. Resource management became increasingly important on the Japanese side. As the number of available escorts lagged behind the volume of traffic requiring protection, priority convoys were designated for vital cargoes such as oil, aviation fuel, and military equipment. Less critical shipments sailed with minimal or no escort, accepting higher risk of loss. Fuel constraints also affected escort operations. Destroyers and cruisers originally designed for fleet actions had high consumption rates. Assigning them to continuous convoy duty required careful allocation of bunker oil that was itself transported in vulnerable tankers. These interlocking demands limited how far and how often escorts could accompany convoys, leaving certain stretches of sea more exposed to submarine attack. For U.S. forces, adaptation included refining the use of intelligence. Traffic analysis, aerial reconnaissance, and intercepted communications gradually provided a clearer picture of Japanese shipping patterns. Nimitz's staff and Lockwood's operations officers used this information to reposition patrol lines and assign boats to areas where high-value targets were expected. Submarines were sent increasingly to straits, headlands, and convergence points where convoys had limited room to maneuver. This concentration of effort contrasted with the earlier, more dispersed patrols that had attempted to cover broad ocean areas without detailed knowledge of traffic flows. The psychological dimension of resistance and adaptation affected individuals on both sides. Japanese merchant crews and naval escorts sailed knowing that the probability of encountering submarines on certain routes had risen sharply compared to 1942. Repeated alarms, depth charge attacks, and searches for periscope wakes became part of routine voyages. For U.S. submariners, the increased number of contacts and engagements brought higher expectations, but also more frequent counterattacks. Crew members had to adjust to longer periods at silent running depth after firing, extended sequences of depth charges, and occasional damage that required at-sea repairs far from base. Local populations along key sea lanes also adapted to the changing character of the war at sea. In the Philippines, on the coasts of China and Formosa, and around ports such as Singapore and Saigon, fishermen and coastal communities observed new convoy assembly practices, blackout regulations, and restricted zones around naval installations. Some harbors saw the construction of additional breakwaters, net defenses, and repair facilities to keep damaged ships in service. In Allied-held regions such as Australia and later the Philippines, after their recapture, port workers and dockyard personnel supported the intensified tempo of submarine operations by handling turnarounds, repairs, and resupply cycles on compressed schedules. Within command structures, the pattern of resistance and adaptation produced an ongoing cycle of directive and response. Japanese staff analyses of convoy losses led to recommendations for route changes, escort tactics, and air patrol patterns. U.S. assessments of attack results and submarine losses fed into adjustments in torpedo settings, approach methods, and patrol assignments. In both navies, debates took place over the balance between offensive missions and protective duties, between concentration on military targets and the need to safeguard or disrupt economic flows. For Nimitz and Lockwood, the task was to align technical improvements and operational practices with an overall strategy that treated submarine warfare as a central instrument of pressure, while their counterparts in Tokyo sought through incremental measures to preserve the maritime connections on which Japan's war effort depended. By late 1944, the cumulative pressure of submarine attacks, airstrikes, and surface engagements brought the maritime war in the Pacific to a turning point. The recapture of the Marianas and the landings on Leyte placed U.S. carrier and land-based aircraft within range of major Japanese sea routes, while submarines were shifted to concentrate on the remaining corridors linking Southeast Asian resource areas with the home islands. Chester Nimitz's staff and Charles Lockwood's headquarters coordinated patrol patterns so that boats operated in layers around Luzon, Formosa, and the South China Sea, aiming to cut the main northbound traffic at multiple points rather than along a single line. A series of convoy battles in late 1944 and early 1945 illustrated how this new concentration operated. Convoys carrying oil and reinforcements from Borneo and the Netherlands East Indies toward Japan were intercepted in the South China Sea and around the Luzon Strait by groups of U.S. submarines acting on intelligence about sailing dates and routes. Multiple attacks over several days, sometimes involving different boats striking the same convoy at successive points, reduced the number of tankers reaching port. Japanese escort groups responded with depth charge barrages and route changes, but the combination of submarine, carrier-based, and land-based attacks made it more difficult to shift traffic to alternative paths without exposing it to other forms of interdiction. For Japanese decision-makers, the loss of these convoys had strategic consequences. Reports from the Ministry of Commerce and Industry and the Navy Ministry indicated that stocks of fuel oil, aviation gasoline, and certain metals were falling to levels that could not sustain both fleet operations and civilian needs. Choices had to be made between supporting distant garrisons in the Philippines, Indonesia, and New Guinea, or concentrating remaining shipping on essential deliveries to the home islands and nearby territories. In practice, many isolated garrisons received reduced supplies or were effectively left to depend on local resources and occasional small craft, while larger convoys were reserved for critical cargoes and routes. Lockwood and his staff interpreted this situation as confirmation that the submarine campaign had reached a point where it could directly influence Japan's operational options at sea. Patrol orders increasingly emphasized tankers and large freighters as primary targets, even when escorts were strong. Boats were instructed to accept higher risk in well-defended waters if the prospective impact on fuel flows justified it. At the same time, procedures for rescuing downed Allied airmen and providing weather and reconnaissance reports to carrier and bomber forces were formalized, integrating submarines more closely into the wider campaign. The turning point also manifested itself in Japanese tactical innovation. In late 1944, the Navy introduced manned torpedoes, known as Kaiten, launched from modified submarines against Allied anchorages and shipping. These operations reflected both a search for new ways to counter Allied maritime superiority and the constraints imposed by dwindling conventional resources. Several attacks damaged or sank Allied ships, particularly in anchorages and staging areas. But they did not alter the overall balance at sea. Conventional Japanese submarines, operating in reduced numbers and under fuel restrictions, could no longer sustain a broad offensive against U.S. logistics lines comparable to the pressure U.S. submarines exerted on Japanese routes. For civilians in Japan, the turning point at sea coincided with intensifying effects on daily life. Reduced imports of rice, soybeans, and other foodstuffs from Korea, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia contributed to tighter rationing. Coal shortages affected railway operations and household heating, These developments were influenced by multiple factors, including air raids and domestic production limits, but the loss of shipping capacity formed a central link in the chain connecting distant battles to conditions in cities such as Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. Allied prisoners of war and civilian internees transported in the later stages of the conflict encountered the consequences of this maritime situation in concentrated form. Ships designated for their movement were often older vessels assigned to lower priority convoys, sometimes with minimal escort. When such ships were torpedoed, survival rates could be low, particularly in remote ocean areas where search and rescue resources were scarce. These incidents underscored how a strategy aimed at weakening an opponent's industrial and military base through shipping losses could intersect with broader patterns of coercion, captivity, and forced labor. Within U.S. submarines, the sense that the campaign had passed a decisive threshold coexisted with awareness that individual patrols remained hazardous. Even as tonnage figures indicated growing dominance, boats continued to be lost to mines, depth charges, and accidents. Lockwood's reports to Nimitz combine statistics on sinkings with lists of missing submarines, balancing recognition of operational success with the reality that each additional patrol involved crews whose return could not be guaranteed. For planners on both sides, the turning point in the submarine war thus appeared not as a single event, but as a period in which cumulative trends removed options and narrowed futures, setting the conditions for the final phase of the conflict at sea and on land. In the first half of 1945, the pattern of submarine warfare in the Pacific shifted from expansion to contraction as the operational framework of the Japanese war effort narrowed. After the loss of the Philippines and the closure of many long-range routes, remaining Japanese merchant shipping concentrated on shorter connections between the home islands, Korea, Formosa, and a few surviving sources of coal and foodstuffs in nearby regions. U.S. submarines adjusted accordingly, patrolling closer to Japan in the East China Sea, the Yellow Sea, and the approaches to the Inland Sea. Minefields laid by aircraft and submarines further restricted Japanese movements, forcing convoys into narrow channels where attacks were easier to stage but also more hazardous for the attackers because of coastal defenses and anti-submarine patrols. By this stage, Japanese submarines operated under increasingly severe constraints. Fuel shortages limited both training and patrols. Many boats were used for transport missions to isolated garrisons, carrying small quantities of supplies or evacuating personnel, rather than conducting extended offensive patrols. Others were assigned to Kaitan operations, or to last attempts to attack Allied concentrations off Okinawa and in forward anchorages. Losses to air attack, surface escorts, and mines reduced the effective submarine fleet, and the ability to influence Allied logistics across the Pacific had largely disappeared. For crews, the distinction between front line and rear areas weakened as air raids and fuel shortages reached bases that had previously been relatively secure. Within the U.S. submarine force, the last patrols combined high operational experience with awareness that the end of the war might be near. Boats continued to sink merchant and naval vessels off Japan, Korea, and China, but the number of high-value targets diminished as Japanese shipping stocks declined, and many larger units remained in port for lack of fuel. Patrol reports recorded more encounters with small coastal craft and fewer with large convoys. At the same time, submarines took on additional roles: lifeguard duty for bomber and fighter operations near Japan, weather reporting, and reconnaissance of potential landing areas. These missions exposed crews to new types of risk, including proximity to heavily defended coastlines and frequent overflights by both Allied and Japanese aircraft. The humanitarian dimension of the campaign's final phase reflected accumulated damage at sea. Sunken ships, damaged ports, and minefields complicated evacuation and relief efforts even before hostilities formally ended. Japanese civilians attempting to move between islands or return from former colonial territories faced long delays and limited transport capacity. Allied prisoners of war and civilian internees still held in camps across Asia depended on local arrangements and improvised shipping, some of it in vessels that had already survived earlier stages of the war. For naval planners, the immediate priority remained the conduct of operations, but staff officers also began to draft outlines for post-war clearance of mines and the rehabilitation of shipping routes that had been contested for years. When Japan announced its intention to accept surrender terms in August 1945, signals went out to both submarine forces. U.S. submarines at sea received orders to cease offensive operations, report positions, and avoid actions that might be interpreted as hostile while formal arrangements were completed. Commanders recorded last sightings of enemy ships without attacking them and altered course toward designated rendezvous points. Japanese submarines were ordered to return to port or remain in designated areas pending instructions from Allied authorities. In some cases, crews scuttled their boats rather than surrender them. In others, vessels were handed over intact. The process of withdrawal unfolded in stages. U.S. submarines on patrol returned to bases at Pearl Harbor, Guam, Midway, and Australian ports, where they offloaded torpedoes, ammunition, and sensitive equipment. Crews began demobilization procedures, with personnel reassigned, discharged, or retained for occupation duties and training roles. Mechanical inspections assessed the condition of hulls and machinery after multiple war patrols. Some boats were earmarked for continued service in a reduced peacetime fleet, others for reserve status or eventual disposal. Command staffs compiled statistical summaries of patrols, sinkings, and losses, forming the basis for internal evaluations and post-war historical studies. On the Japanese side, the surrender exposed the cumulative effect of years of attrition at sea. Harbor surveys and administrative reports documented the small number of serviceable merchant ships and submarines remaining compared to pre-war fleets. Many hulls lay damaged in shallow waters near ports or in deeper anchorages, requiring decisions about salvage or abandonment. Merchant mariners, naval personnel, and civilian port workers faced an abrupt shift from supporting war logistics to participating in reconstruction under Allied supervision. Repatriation voyages for soldiers, civilians, and prisoners of war had to be organized using a reduced and aging pool of ships, often under strict control by occupation authorities concerned with safety and the presence of mines. For individuals directly involved in submarine warfare, the end of combat operations did not immediately resolve the effects of years of service. U.S. veterans of multiple patrols returned to families and civilian life with experiences shaped by extended periods underwater, repeated engagements, and the loss of comrades whose boats had not returned. Japanese submariners and merchant sailors who survived had to integrate wartime service into lives now constrained by defeat, occupation, and economic disruption. Civilians in coastal regions around the Pacific continued to live with reminders of the conflict in the form of wrecks, unexploded ordnance, and altered trade patterns, even as regular traffic slowly resumed under new political and economic conditions shaped by the outcome of the war. In the decades after 1945, historians, naval officers, and policymakers examined the submarine campaign in the Pacific as both a case study and a precedent. Statistical reconstruction showed that U.S. submarines, which had represented a small fraction of the Pacific Fleet's total manpower, were responsible for sinking roughly half of all Japanese merchant tonnage lost during the war, amounting to several million gross tons and more than 1,000 ships. Japanese analyses conducted under Allied direction after the surrender linked these losses to declines in fuel deliveries, reduced industrial output, and constraints on the deployment of major fleet units in the final years of the conflict. At the same time, the destruction of shipping was only one among several factors, including strategic bombing and the loss of forward bases, that together shaped Japan's defeat. For Chester Nimitz, Charles Lockwood, and their contemporaries in the U.S. Navy, post-war evaluations emphasized operational lessons. Reports and staff studies highlighted the importance of reliable weapons, coordinated intelligence, and flexible doctrine. The torpedo problems that had limited early results became examples of how technical assumptions must be tested under realistic conditions, while the eventual adoption of coordinated attack groups illustrated the advantages and risks of radio-linked operations over long distances. Training curricula at U.S. naval institutions incorporated case studies of patrols, convoy battles, and command decisions, treating the Pacific experience as a foundation for future undersea warfare, in an era increasingly defined by nuclear propulsion and ballistic missile submarines. Japanese naval officers and civilian analysts approach the same record from a different perspective. Memoirs and official histories examine the delayed introduction of convoy systems, the limited number of dedicated escorts, and the prioritization of fleet actions over economic protection. Some studies argued that earlier and more systematic convoy organization might have reduced shipping losses, while others pointed to structural constraints in shipbuilding capacity and fuel supply that restricted available options. The wartime use of submarines primarily against warships, and later for supply and special missions, was reassessed in light of the demonstrated impact of commerce warfare conducted by a numerically smaller but differently directed force. The human consequences of the campaign became an important theme in both countries. In Japan, accounts by merchant mariners, port workers, and coastal residents documented their experiences of convoy assembly, attacks at sea, and life in cities affected by shortages of imported food and fuel. In the United States and allied countries, veterans' narratives described long patrols, engagements with convoys, and encounters with survivors in lifeboats or in the water. Studies of prisoner of war movements and forced labor traced how the sinking of transports carrying POWs and civilian deportees resulted from a combination of Japanese transport policies and the targeting priorities of a submarine force that generally lacked detailed information about passengers on merchant ships. International law and ethics debates use the Pacific Submarine War as one reference point in broader discussions about economic warfare and non-combatant protection. The shift to unrestricted submarine warfare in 1941 and the subsequent destruction of merchant shipping raised questions about how to classify crews, passengers, and cargoes in an era when civilian vessels were integrated into military logistics. Comparative studies considered similarities and differences between U.S. submarine operations in the Pacific and German U-boat campaigns in the Atlantic, noting contrasts in strategic context, doctrine, and outcomes, as well as shared issues of risk to civilians and prisoners. In material terms, the legacy of the campaign remained visible for many years in the form of wrecks and minefields across the Pacific and Asian coastal waters. Post-war clearance operations, salvage efforts, and hydrographic surveys gradually reopened routes that had been contested or closed. Some submarines were preserved as museum ships, allowing visitors to see the confined spaces in which crews had lived and fought. Others were scrapped or sunk as targets, their wartime roles recorded primarily in patrol reports, logbooks, and later historical works. Within professional military education and public history, figures such as Nimitz and Lockwood appeared as representatives of a particular mode of command, senior officers with pre-war submarine experience who oversaw the transition from experimental doctrine to large-scale, sustained undersea campaigns. Japanese counterparts, including staff officers responsible for shipping and anti-submarine defense, were studied for the choices they made under conditions of resource scarcity and strategic pressure. The interaction of their decisions, rather than the actions of any single individual, formed the central narrative of how submarine warfare influenced the course of the Pacific War. Over time, interpretations of U.S. submarine warfare broadened beyond operational effectiveness to include economic, social, and regional dimensions. Scholars connected shipping losses to patterns of post-war reconstruction, shifts in maritime trade routes, and changes in shipbuilding and port infrastructure in Japan and its former colonies. Local studies from Southeast Asia, Micronesia, and coastal China examined how the presence of submarines and the disruption of traffic affected fishing, inter-island commerce, and colonial administrations. These perspectives place the undersea campaign within a wider system of wartime and post-war transformations. In collective memory, the submarine war in the Pacific occupied a complex position. It lacked the single, decisive battle that characterized some land and carrier campaigns, but its cumulative effects were central to the shifting balance of resources that underlay visible operations on land and in the air. For participants, whether commanders like Nimitz and Lockwood, Japanese planners managing declining fleets of ships, or civilians whose lives were shaped by disrupted sea lanes, the conflict beneath the surface represented a continuous, often unseen dimension of the wider war. Its legacy persisted not only in policy and doctrine, but also in the ongoing study of how maritime vulnerabilities, technological change, and human decision-making interact in prolonged conflicts.